Welcome to Chapter 3, Finding Relationships Among Variables. Introduction. The primary interest in data analysis is usually in relationships between variables. The most useful numeric summary measure is correlation. The most useful graph is a scatter plot. To break down numerical variable and categorical variables it is useful to create side-by-side box plots. In Excel, a pivot table breaks down one variable by the other, so all sorts of relationships. And a diagram in the file Data Analysis Taxonomy gives you the big picture which analyses are appropriate for which data types and which tools are best performing variable analysis. Relationships among categorical variables. The most meaningful way to examine relationships between two categorical variables is to count and corresponding charts of the counts. You can find counts of the category of either variable separated as well as counts in joint categories of the two variables. Corresponding percentages of totals and charts help tell a story. It is customary to display all such counts in a table called a crosstab, a cross-tabulation. This is also sometimes known as a contingency table. Relationships between smoking and drinking. To use the crosstab to explore relationships between smoking and drinking. Solution. Datasets list smoking and drinking habits of 8,761 adults. Categories have been coded N, O, H, S, and D for non, occasionally heavy smoker, and drinker. To create crosstabs, enter the categorical headings in Excel. Use the COUNTIF function to fill the table with counts of joints category. Next, sum arrows, rows, and down columns to get totals, then express the count as percentages of the percentage rows and columns. Relationships between smoking and drinking. Count versus percentage. There is no single correct way to display data in a crosstab. Showing the counts as percentages of the total of the row totals or percentages of column totals usually makes any relationship stand out more clearly. Corresponding charts are also very useful. Relationships among categorical variables and numeric variables. The comparison problem is one of the most important problems in data analysis. It occurs whenever you want to compare a numeric measure across two or more subpopulations. Example, the subpopulations are males and females, a numerical measure in salary. The subpopulations are different regions of the country, a numeric measures in the cost of living. The subpopulations are different days of the week, and numeric measures is the number of customers going to a particular fast food chain. Stacked and unstacked format. There are two possible data formats, stacked and unstacked. The data are stacked if there are two long variables such as gender and salary. The idea that the male salaries are stacked in the female salaries. This is the format you'll see in a vast majority of situations. You will occasionally see unstacked format when there are two short variables such as male salaries and female salaries. Stat Tools is capable of dealing either format, can convert stacked to unstacked and vice versa. And you can see what stacked everything is in one, and unstacked it's separated out by male, female, and baseball salaries. Object to learn methods and stat tools for breaking down baseball salaries by various categorical variables. Solutions. Data set contains the same 2018 data example previously, as well as extra categorical variables. Create summary measures by selecting one variable summary from Summary Statistics drop list. Next, click the Format button and choose Stacked, then choose the categoric cat variable you want to categorize by and the val variable you want to summarize. Baseball salaries. There are a lot of numbers to digest. It is difficult to get a clear picture of the difference across positions. It is more enlightening to see the graphical summary of this information. Side-by-side box plots are our favorite graphical way of comparing the distribution of numeric variables across categories. If you have Excel 2016 or later, you can use the box plot salary by position. First, select the two columns of data, position and salary, then select the box plot from the statistical chart, and you'll list it. And as you can see in the chart, $5 million, and with highs of going up. That's the average. This shows the distribution of the data. Baseball salaries. In Stat Tools, create a side-by-side box plot by selecting Box and Whisker Plot from the summary graphs drop-down list and filling in the results. Select the stacked format so you can choose a cat variable and a val variable. Baseball salaries. You can often create a categorical variable on the fly with an if formula and use the side-by-side box plot. We did this for the Yankees, for example. Yankees versus non-Yankees. You can kind of see the box part and the whiskers, how it compares. Relationships among numeric variables. To study a relationship among numeric variables, a new type of chart called a scatter plot and two new summary measures, correlation and covariance, are used. These measures can be applied to any variables that are displayed numerically. However, there are appropriately only for truly numeric variables, not the categorical variables that have been coded numerically. Scatter plot. A scatter plot is a scatter of points which each point donates a value of an observation for selected variable, for two selected variables, if the graphical method of detecting relationships between two numeric variables. The two variables are often labeled generically as x and y, so the scatter plot is also called an XY chart. The purpose of the scatter plot is to make a relationship or lack of it apparent. Golf stats on the PGA Tour. To use a scatter plot to search for relationships in golf data. Data sets include observations for each of the top 200 earners in the PGA Tour. And Stat Tools designated a Stat Tools data set for a particular year. Excuse me. Next, select Scatter Plot from the summary graphs, drop down, and select at least one X variable and at least one Y variable. Age of events. Age versus events, and age versus earnings. So you kind of see the different things that we have. We also have earnings versus events, and as you can see, as they start going, number of events they play, the more money they make. Earnings, cuts made. Earnings versus yards. So you can see how we break down all the data, how everything is broken down, all based on salary. Trend lines in the scatter plot. Once you have the scatter plot, Excel enables you to superimpose one of several trend lines. A trend line is a line or a curve that fits the scatter as well as possible. This could be a straight line or it could be one of several types of curves. To add a trend line, right-click it and point to the chart, select Add Trend Line, and fill out the resulting dialog box. So here we have a negative trend. Correlation and covariance. Correlation and covariance measure the strength of the direction of the linear relationship between two numeric variables. The relationship is strong if the points of the scatter diagram are closely around the straight line. If this straight line rises from the left to right, the relationship is positive and measures will be positive numbers. If it falls from left to right, the relationship is negative and the measures will be negative numbers. The two numerical variables must be paired variables. They must have the same number of observations, and values for any observer should be naturally paired. Covariance is essential for the average of products and deviation of this. So this is the formula. In Excel, we just use the covariance function, and stat tools also. Covariance has a serious limitation as a descriptive measures because it is very sensitive to the units and the xy's that are being measured. The correlation is a unitless quantity that is unaffected by the measurement scale. The correlation is always between -1 and 1. The closer it is to these two experiments, the closer the points together in a straight line. We have in Excel has the built-in correl function, and stat tools also calculates correlation automatically. Correlation and covariance. 3 important points about scatter plots, correlation, covariance. Correlation is a single number summary of the scatter plot. It never conveys as much information as the full scatter plot. You are usually on the lookout for large correlations near -1 or 1. Do not even try to interpret covariance numerical, except possibly to check whether the positive or negative for interpretation purposes, concentration on the correlation. Golf stats of the PGA Tour. Objective: to use correlation to understand relations in golf data. Solutions: in stat tools, create a table in correlation by selecting correlation and covariance from the summary. Fill in the resulting dialog box by checking correlation. So as here we can kind of see a little bit of some of the correlations is what we're showing. Everything is between 1 and -1, and we can see where it falls. So here's the XY chart. We have a positive correlation. And as they continue, if we look up here, this is the rounds, cuts made. So if they make the cuts, chances are they're going to also, more rounds they play, the more cuts they make. Pivot table is an Excel tool that allows you to break data down by categories. Sometimes pivot tables are used to display tables of counts, often called crosstabs or contingency tables. However, crosstabs is typically lists only counts, whereas pivot tables can list counts, sums, averages, and sums of measures. Customer order elements. To use pivot tables to break down customer order data and by number of category values. Data set contains 400 customers, order several months at Elk Mark Company. So we have the data. We create our pivot table. This is how we do it. We go to Insert, Create a Pivot Table by clicking the Pivot Table button. The top selection of the dialog box allows you to specify the table or range that contains the data. The bottom selection allows you to select the location where you want the results to be placed. Let's produce a blank pivot table. Assuming any cell inside the blank pivot table is selected, the pivot table super tabs is visible. The super tab has 2 ribbons: Analysis and Design. Finally, a pivot table field pane is visible. The pane indicates that a pivot table has 4 areas. These are filters, rows, columns, and values that correspond to the 4 areas in the blank pivot table where you can put fields. Customer order in Elk Mark. A row's field has categories that could go down the left side of the pivot table. Columns field has categories that go across the top. Filter lets you filter the whole pivot table by its category. A values field must contain data you want to summarize. Typically, but not always, you'll place the category variables in the filter rows in the columns area, and you'll place numeric values in the value area. So this kind of breaks it down. Check time, region, and total cost boxes in the upper half of the pivot table fields. Choose from 3 layouts: compact, online, tabular, available for the remote layout. Hiding categories, filtering. When you place the categorical field in the rows, columns, and or filter areas, all this category shows by default. It is often useful to filter out and hide some of these categories. This lets you focus on the categories you are most interested in. Sorting. It's an easy way to sort the pivot table, either by the number in the values area or by the labels in the rows or columns. To sort by the number in the values area, right-click any number and select Sort. To sort on the labels of the rows or the columns field, right-click on any of the categories and select Sort. You can also collect the drop-down arrows for the field and get dialog box that allow both sorting and filtering. Pivot charts. It's easy to accompany pivot tables with charts. These charts adapt automatically to the underlying pivot table. To create a pivot chart, click anywhere inside the pivot table, select the pivot chart button, and it allows you to have that. Multi-variables in the value area. More than a single variable can be placed in the area. Also, a given variable is the values area can be summarized by more than the summary of the functions. Summarizing by count. The variables in the value area can be summarized by the count function. This is useful when you want to know, for example, how many of the orders were placed by females in the South. Right-click the number values in the pivot chart, select the values fields, select count function. Grouping. Categories in the rows or columns variables can be grouped. Suppose you want to summarize some of the total costs by date. Starting with a blank pivot table, check both date and total cost in the pivot table frame, and then select group. Frozen lasagna dinners. Objective: to use the pivot table to explore which demographic variables help to distinguish lasagna tiers from non-tiers. Solution dataset contains over 900 potential customers being tracked by Frozen Lasagna Company. Set up a pivot table that shows the count for tiers and non-tiers for different categories. Thank you. That was Chapter 3.